StoryHinge, Episode 68, Joshua Shea, The Addiction No One Will Talk About.
You know, I've read it 4,000 times in all the research I've done. Yeah, it's about a child feeling like they can come to you and say, hey, I saw this, or hey, I stumbled upon this. Because they want guidance. They want to learn. They want to feel protected because, you know, stumbling upon something incredibly explicit is disconcerting for a kid.
Welcome to StoryHinge. At StoryHinge, we explore foundational ideas and beliefs. We believe everyone has a beautiful story to grow. Now here's your host, Jason Vidaurri.
All right, welcome to StoryHinge, all. And, you know, I'm excited today to talk with our guest. And, you know, honestly, there's a little bit of a trepidation in this discussion. I think it'll be a little bit challenging, but I think it's an important discussion to have. Now, today's guest is Joshua Shea. Several years ago, Josh was in the middle of a successful business, but underneath it all, he was going through porn and alcohol addiction, which eventually led him to criminal activity and possession of underage pornography, for which he served 6 months in jail back in 2016. Afterwards, Joshua wrote the book called The Addiction No One Will Talk About: How I Let Pornography Addiction Hurt People and Destroy Relationships. And although it's a tough subject to talk about, I think it's important because I think we do such a poor job about this subject, about sex, sexuality, about pornography, and I think we can do better. And so I'm giving this also with some warning for those of you that might not want to hear about such a topic, or it's too difficult to hear about. So we totally understand here, and I want to just give you that forewarning about it. You know, we intend to talk openly about this, but not graphically or anything in terms of details in that way. So with that, I want to welcome our guest today, Joshua Shea.
Thank you very much for having me today, Jason.
Yeah, and this is going to be I guess to me, kind of an interesting area, and there's probably multiple areas we can talk about. But here we like to usually jump back and hear some of your background, some of the key parts of your story that led up to where you're at today, and we'll be diving into different parts of that. So why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
Okay, well, the Cliff's Notes version is my name is Joshua Shea. I am from Central Maine, and I've recently published a book called The Addiction Nobody Will Talk About: How I Let My Pornography Addiction Hurt People and Destroy Relationships. And essentially, it talks about my porn addiction, my alcoholism, and my mental health issues, and how I didn't take care of myself for a period of time, 2012, 2013, 2014, eventually leading to an arrest for possessing underage pornography. As far as my story goes, I was a well-known magazine publisher in Central Maine. I created one of the largest film festivals in Maine to that point, and I also served on my city's city council. So when I was arrested, it was back in early 2014. It was a very, very big deal, and it outed me for having these addictions that I tried so hard for so many years to not let anybody in on.
Okay. So let's go back to maybe some of that start of that, perhaps the start of when the magazine started, because I believe you were also in publishing in stories from your whole career.
Yeah, I was one day working at, I was 17 years old. It was summertime between my junior and senior year of high school, and I'm on a break from my really crappy job at the Burger King on the Maine Turnpike. And I picked up a newspaper, and I was looking through the sports section, and there was a little ad that said they were looking for high school students and others who were interested in becoming sports clerks. And I had no idea what that meant, but I knew it didn't take place at Burger King on the Maine Turnpike, and anything was better than that. So I walked into the newspaper office the next day, And within 2-3 days, I was hired. And essentially, I've worked in news either as a journalist, an editor, or a publisher straight through up through 2014. And that was starting back in 1993.
Okay. Okay, great. And we might jump back into some of that. Why don't you bring us up to, I guess, about when the magazine started, and let's walk through that story a bit.
Yeah, I was working as the editor and publisher of a weekly newspaper in a city in Windham, or town in Maine called Windham, and we had the big banking housing crisis back in 2008. We saw our revenues be cut by a third overnight. And in looking at how things were going, I recognized that we needed another product if we were going to stay afloat. Thought about a couple of ideas. I'd always had this concept for a high-end magazine in central Maine. There was one down in the Portland area, and most people are familiar with Portland when it comes to Maine. And there was one up in Bangor, which is much further north in Maine. But there really wasn't anything in central Maine that looked at dining or arts and entertainment. And granted, it's not the most happening place on earth, but there is enough. And I think these kinds of magazines make people feel good about what's going on. So in the middle of what was pretty harsh recession, I convinced the other people who I worked with and the owner of the company that we should go ahead and try to do a high-end, glossy lifestyle magazine for Central Maine. And I came up with about a 5-year plan, how we'd ramp this up, how everything would work, and it exploded like nothing I had ever been a part of. It was a success within weeks. I had no idea what was going to happen. I make the joke that my 5-year plan was done three months into the lifetime of the magazine. So it was really a shock for me to go from being a editor for a small little newspaper to one of the most well-read magazines in the state.
Wow. And so as that's ramping up and things are starting to become successful, what was it like for you, I guess, maybe more on a day-to-day kind of picture?
Well, you'd have to know me as a person beforehand. I've always been somebody who, had quite a bit of a narcissistic streak. And I came to understand a lot more about what that was about later on through recovery. But this was exactly the kind of thing that shouldn't happen to somebody who had my personality type. Because I was always a trophy collector. I was always looking for the approval of others. And then suddenly when you create this product that everybody wants to be a part of, people were throwing money at us. People wanted to be in there no matter what. We were getting awards left and right. It was unbelievable. And I slowly or quickly, depending on who you talk to, I guess, became an absolutely insufferable bastard to be around. Because I thought that I ruled the world and was one of the most powerful people, because for a period of time, from when we started the magazine in 2010 up till about 2012, I just had an amazing stretch of luck where everything I touched turned to gold. And when that happens, somebody like me who can really lose perspective easily completely goes off the rails.
Wow. And at the time, I imagine you didn't realize that. It's more looking back.
It is looking back. It's one of these things where I knew that what was happening to me didn't happen to most people. I had worked so hard and so much wanted people to see me as special and something more than everybody else. And when I'm suddenly being asked to come give luncheon speeches to 500 people, or I'm asked to deliver the commencement address at the high school in front of 3,000 people, well, there's only one commencement speaker per year. And the fact that I got to be it, in my head said that was really something special. I knew that a lot of people didn't like me or thought that I was really a pain to be around. but it didn't matter to me because they needed me much more than I needed them, or at least that's what I thought in my head.
Okay. And you mentioned your personality that fed into that. Is there other elements, I guess, other foundational elements in you that started to feed in this? And then
As I mentioned, there are mental health issues. I was first diagnosed as having a generalized anxiety disorder when I was around 20. When I was 24, 25, and this is going back more than 15 years now, I was finally correctly diagnosed as bipolar. And once that happened, I was able to look back and see all of the absolutely crazy manic stuff that I'd done in my life. I only noticed anything was wrong when I felt depressed. I never recognized that my manic side was also a big problem and caused quite a few problems for me along the way in life. And I also had these hidden addictions of pornography and alcoholism. My porn addiction and my alcohol addiction, I tell people they both started the first time I touched either substance. The first time I saw hardcore pornography when I was 12, 13 years old, I knew that I had discovered something special, something that was going to play a big role in my life, something that was, it's hard to explain it. And when I first time I got drunk, probably around 15 years old, maybe 16, it was the exact same kind of feeling. It was like, this makes me feel better. This makes me feel complete. This takes away pain. This takes away worry. This is just something that, wow, does everybody know how amazing this is? So, and both addictions, they were always there. They came and went over the next 20 years. If I was dating a woman, or, my first many years with my wife, the porn wasn't that big a deal. I found that I mostly drank when I had to be out in public, as a bit of a, liquid courage or, anxiety reducer. So when I had jobs where I was sitting at home doing writing or doing editing, my drinking wasn't that much of a problem. However, when suddenly I'm the face of a majorly popular publication and I'm at a different event every night, oftentimes being expected to speak, I have a few beers at the office before I leave. And then when I get there, everybody wants to buy me a drink. I probably didn't buy a drink for 3 years, but boy, did I drink all those years. And that was those elements, my mental illness and my addictions, which I tried to hide. Certainly, I did not manage those the way that they needed to be managed.
And how was that? As the magazine's taken off, and it sounds like this is becoming more prevalent as a type of escape. It sounds like. How did that impact your day-to-day, these addictions?
Well, it's one of those things where you can figure out how to drink and make it look very social. Let's go out to lunch with, let me take my team out to lunch, and I'm going to be the cool boss so everybody can have a beer. And it's 3:30, 4 o'clock. Let's schedule some happy hour meetings with clients or whatnot. So I can drink from 4 to 6 or 7, perfectly fine. Okay, well, then we've got to head off to another event. Because we're getting this award or we're presenting this award or whatever's happening. So we'll drink a little more there. It was really, and I think it is just, the culture of white collar America, that alcohol plays a giant role. And I was never around anybody too much, including, my wife and kids when I got home, and I'd have another drink or two before they went to bed. And then I'd pour even more after they went to bed. After they went to bed was when I utilized the pornography. And, it was one of those things where the drinking was easy to get by everybody because nobody thinks about it. And with the porn, I just waited till nobody was around. And late at night, once everybody was gone from telling me how great I was, once there wasn't this magazine to be putting together because I was done my work for the day, once the family had gone to bed, it was just me by myself. And that was not a healthy thing back then. So I was drinking and using porn into the early hours of the morning.
And now that you mentioned that, what was the relationship with your family like during this time?
When the magazine started, it was great. They were, I mean, and you know, when the kids were young, and my first 10 years of marriage, everything was very good. You know, no problems that don't come with any other marriage or any other family. Uh, when the magazine took off, my wife understood that I would be busy, and when she saw things really take off and be so successful, she I don't think she resented it because she came along for the ride for quite a while, but eventually she needed to get off the ride. She didn't want to be at an art gallery opening every week. She didn't want to be at a black tie dinner, you know, twice a week. She wanted to be home with her family. That was a bigger priority for her. And unfortunately, it wasn't for me. And as time went on, it continued to be less of a priority for me to the point where we, you know, we never got estranged, but there was definitely a distance between us. And there definitely was, you know, I think she just, towards the end, as my business started failing, and I was getting even worse to be around, I think that she largely kind of just tried to protect herself and protect the kids, you know, emotionally and mentally, and I was so checked out by that point. The kids were over the magazine and over me being a local celebrity. It was just, and I was the only one who wasn't over me. We coexisted. Like I said, it wasn't miserable. It wasn't acrimonious. It was just, we coexisted.
Okay. So when we go back to the magazine, we got to where it's basically ramping up and things are getting good. And let's take that story and see where it goes.
Sure. Yeah, it was so much fun because, keep in mind, I had been a writer for newspapers for 14 years, I think, up to that point. And as a writer, you know, you want to tell great stories, you want to tell important stories, but a lot of times the stories you want to tell aren't the stories that your editor is assigning. Or if you get a great story, your editor can come by and say, well, we only want 800 words, and you think you've got 2,000 words worth of material. So one of the reasons I started the magazine, or one of the great benefits of starting the magazine, was that I could finally tell the stories I wanted to write at a length I wanted to have them, presented in a way I wanted to have them. I mean, it was a total control thing, but I realized, I looked at what I was doing as a bit of an art form, and I thought that, you know, it just hadn't been done around here. And thankfully I nailed it. You know, there was some tweaking the first few issues of content and what it had to be. I quickly realized that it couldn't be just the magazine I wanted to read. It had to be the magazine that the community wanted to read. And I learned little things like people really like to read about stories they were part of. People like nostalgia, but they don't really like nostalgia from way before they were born. They want to remember the good times. Local history, but local history of only the last 75 years became a big piece of what we were doing. We worked in Q&As into almost every issue. It's one of my favorite formats for interviewing because it really is challenging to make it come across smooth. And you know, I was even learning how to do photography, something that I'd never really done in my entire life. So creatively, I was so happy to be working on this magazine. From a business end, I'm not a very good business person, and I know that, but things were going so well and so much money was coming through the door for advertising that all of my warts and inabilities when it came to business were covered. And you know, eventually that led to be part of the problem, but everything went so well. I was professionally satisfied. I was personally, creatively satisfied. Monetarily, I was making better money than I'd ever had, and I completely controlled everything. I decided what our office was going to look like. I decided what events we went to. I created a world for myself, and there was a lot of people living in it who I had a fair amount of control over, and it was to my head at the time, it was absolutely wonderful.
Okay. And so this goes on for a number of years, and then how do things start turning the other way?
Well, as with anything, the magazine stopped being brand new. And, even though I always tried to position us as, a scrappy up and coming fighter, after 3 or 4 years, advertisers have data on how their advertising works. For some places, well, buying an ad in the local shopper that you pick up for free as you leave the grocery store, that actually works better for them than advertising in a magazine like mine. And so we reached a point where our revenues started plateauing, but our expenses continued to go up. So I tweaked that and tried to work with that, and I just could not make things work well. And as months went by, I became more stressed out. I became more difficult to deal with. I made the horrible, horrible decision to pull myself off of my bipolar meds, thinking that that would somehow give me the kick in the butt that I needed to work a couple extra hours a day, to somehow unleash some kind of creativity and problem solving that would help me get over this hump. Because this started as a plateau, and then it started to slowly go downhill. Unfortunately, thinking that I could tap into my manic side was absolutely ludicrous, and all that really did was cause me to feel like I needed more pornography and more alcohol to offset what the bipolar meds weren't doing. So when you throw a bunch of alcohol and a bunch of porn on top of what was already a very stressful situation, it's really just a powder keg. And I started to alienate my wife and kids even more. I started to alienate my business partners, both at the magazine and at the film festival. I ultimately decided not to run for city council again, because that was a miserable time, and I couldn't even hide my disdain for it when I was doing it. It was just all going downhill. Nothing really pointed in a good direction for me. Once the money turned around, and we weren't making more than we had to give out, it just was a slow and fast, depending on how you look at it, descent for me.
Okay. And let's dive into a little bit the addiction of alcohol and porn, and how do you say, I can see what this, I guess, what is it doing it for you at this time? It sounds like a stress relief. It's an escapism, and that's become more prevalent in your life.
Well, the stress was causing anxiety, because I've got a certain number of employees that I have to make sure they get their weekly check, and they get their benefits. I've got to make sure that the lights stay on. I've got to make sure that the magazine printer gets paid. And I have to do all this while also trying to run other businesses, while trying to keep something of a family life together, which I still did try from time to time. And I became almost paralyzed with fear that I wasn't going to be able to manage it all. And the go-tos that I used for 20 years when I had fear, anxiety, stress had been alcohol and porn. When you take away the benefits of the bipolar medication, I needed that even more. I didn't know how to cope. I didn't know how to survive. I didn't know how to manage day to day. The only way that I could feel like I wasn't going to explode was, to drink a lot of beer or to drink a lot of tequila. The only way that I could feel like I had any control in my life was to look at porn in the middle of the night. Because with pornography, the woman or man or whatever you're looking at, they never say no. They're there. They're ready for you. There's no real intimacy that has to happen. And this was a crutch of mine, and it was a familiar crutch. And at this point in my life, I don't think that I had felt stress like that, fear like that, anxiety like that. Uh, Going back to being, 4 or 5 years old was the last time I probably had that kind of emotional reaction to my environment. And I did what I knew what to do to make myself feel better. Unfortunately, since I was 10 times worse than I'd ever been, I needed 10 times the alcohol. I needed 10 times the porn.
And as you're going through this, are you any alarms going off saying, wait, Josh, things are falling apart here. You got to get a grip.
For a while, they were. Um, I think that probably, and a spoiler alert, I end up getting arrested in this story. And I would say about 4 or 5 months before I got arrested was when I stopped telling myself that something had to change or something was going to change. I knew I was headed down a very bad road, but there was so much going on. And also keep in mind, I'm now at this point only sleeping probably 3 hours a night, maybe four. Um, I was not eating well at all, no exercise. I was probably showering once a week. I mean, I was in a real state of disrepair. I'd stopped going to all of the awards ceremonies and whatnot towards the end because I stopped getting the awards. People stopped, inviting me to things. It was a pretty quick snowball effect of what was happening. And yeah, the only way that I knew how to make myself feel better as far as an anxiety point of view was to drink. And the only way that I felt like I could exert any control in the world was to look at porn. And as with most addictions, you build a tolerance. You need more and more and more. So the beer became, a lot of tequila, and the pornography, looking at video clips or pictures online, actually became going into chat rooms and interacting with women that way. Because to meet the needs I had to keep escalating the extremeness and the experience of the drinking and of the porn.
Mm-hmm. And so how does this all come collapsing down?
Well, I got to a point where I was engaging women online in chat rooms, 2, 3 in the morning. And what I would do, and these were cam to cam websites, not where you pay somebody to do anything. These were just chat rooms where you could meet somebody, and if you didn't like what you saw on the other end, you hit the button for next, and another person popped up. And if you didn't like what you saw, then you hit next, and another person popped up, and they had that same ability to next you and move on. I couldn't get people to stop for me. I couldn't get women to stop for me with what I looked like. So I ended up figuring out through the help of somebody I met online how to essentially run a catfishing con where I put up a video of a good-looking 23, 24-year-old guy just typing at his computer. Well, suddenly, girls were stopping to talk to me and women were stopping to talk to me. And most of the time, I would try to get the women to take off their shirt, touch themselves, do something to stimulate me. But what was actually being stimulated was nothing sexual, but my need for control. I didn't do this for sexual gratification. I did this because I had no control in my life, and my twisted mind, was getting off on the fact that I would find somebody who seemed like the kind of person who wouldn't do anything voyeuristic online, and then somehow convince her to do it. And I would be patient and I would be cunning and conniving. She thought she was talking to me, but she was talking to a video that I was running. As she would tell me little things about her, I would be doing Google searches and Facebook searches and searches on other different places to learn more about her. And then I'd try to build a rapport and see if I could break her down and get her to do what I wanted. And those times that I could get the woman to do what I wanted, I would usually at the end take a little screen capture and throw it into a folder on my computer. And again, not for sexual pleasure, but just as a trophy. I collected trophies my entire life, and here was a picture that proved that I was capable of still reaching my goals and still achieving something. Um, I did this for several months, and then one morning in March of 2014, the Maine State Police came to my door, showed up in a couple unmarked cars in a van, and told me that they had a search warrant for my home and search warrant for my computers, and that I was under suspicion for possession of child pornography. As it evolved and we talked, and I was arrested, and we can go back to this part of the story later. But what I found out in the discovery several months later was that one of the people who I thought was a woman actually ended up being a 14-year-old girl. And you can't do that. It's morally wrong and it's legally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I had allowed myself to get to a point where, despite the fact that, and I know this, despite the fact that a female may look sexually mature, that doesn't mean they reach the age of 18. But my ability to regulate cause and effect and understanding and appreciating consequences of my actions had largely gone out the window at that point.
And on that day that happens, what's going on with you? Are you this coming as a surprise? What's going on with you?
Well, I mean, it is a surprise. Like I said, there was something in me that said something had to happen in my life for all of this to end. I was very, very, very unhealthy, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, you name it. I mean, I was in bad shape. Had the police not intervened, had my parents or family tried to have some kind of little intervention for me, be it alcohol, or if I had lost my job, there was just so much negative going on in my life. I don't think that taking care of any one thing would have brought me back to health. So with the police showing up, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but they provided the kind of intervention that I really needed, because they changed my entire life in the blink of an eye. Once they started talking to me, I knew what everything was about, and I agreed to an interview with them. They were at my home for about an hour. They confirmed that there was the underage material on my computer by doing some kind of a scan out in the van, I assume. And I was brought to the county jail and booked. I was held there for less than an hour. I called my wife, gave her a very short version of what happened, and asked her to get some money and come bail me out. So she came and bailed me out. The first thing I said when I got into the car was, I completely understand if you want to divorce me, no questions asked. And she just looked at me and said, "Was it little kids?" And I said, "No, it wasn't. It was teenage. It was a teenage girl who, I don't know if I really knew she was too old. I look back at that time, and you've got a podcast here about stories. I was telling myself a lot of stories. Had she said she was 16 or 17, would I have kept going and hit next? I don't know. I like to tell myself if she told me she was 14, I would have done that and just kept on moving on. I was attracted to women or girls or females who looked sexually mature, and not to children who were younger, who didn't reach puberty. And I let my wife know all that, and she's like, "Okay, well, this is something that we will need to work through." And I told her, "Well, let's go down to my office," which was less than half a mile from the jail. And I said, "I need to tell people that I'm not going to be in for a few days." I got down to my office, and only the designer for the magazine was there. And I walked in and said, "Hey, how's it going?" And he just looked at me and said, "What the F did you do?" And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, the Bangor newspaper already has it up on their website that you were nailed with child pornography. And a person from the Lewiston newspaper has come by and knocked on the door looking for you. And at that point, I realized, oh my, this is going to be a very big deal. So I went downstairs, I grabbed a couple things, I went downstairs, got back into the car, and said to my wife, a press release has gone out. This is already all over the place. This is going to be a very big deal. And she looked at me, she's like, no, of course not. And I was like, no, this is going to be a very big deal. And we drove back to my house. Well, we ended up just driving by my house because there was already a TV news van there waiting for us. So we went and we got the kids out of school. We went over to my parents' house, and I don't remember a ton of what happened there because the shock was really setting in at that point. But that evening, once we went home, two more news vans showed up. Each time we ran to the bedroom, and wouldn't answer the door. There was one time, I think it was the 10 o'clock news, they actually broadcast live from in front of my house, and we were in the bedroom watching it, and we could see our dog in the window barking at the person who was reporting. And it was just the strangest thing. I mean, it's beyond surreal to be standing in your bedroom seeing a live news broadcast of the front of your house, talking about this horrible, heinous thing that you did, and you did it, and you don't know what's going to happen next. It was unreal. The very next day, I met my lawyer for the first time, and 10 days later, I entered alcohol rehab in California.
Okay. And this all happened about almost coming up on 4 years ago. Is that right?
Yes. I was arrested on March 20th. So we're just about two and a half weeks away from it being 4 years that I was arrested. I entered and had my very last sip of alcohol on April 1st. 2014. So I'm just about 1 month away from being 4 years sober.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot in that story. I mean, there's a lot of my thoughts are on several different places.
That's why I had to write a book.
Exactly. And I have been able to read your book, and it has a lot of, I think, valuable stuff for part of my desire in this podcast was to talk about stories, of course. And here in season 2, we're trying to dive more into the story itself and understand story better and promote stories that need to be in the world more. And someone might, look at your story and say, well, that doesn't sound like a great story for in the world, but I think there's value in it. And I guess I'm going to do this background here. I'll tell you a little story that happened to me this week with my children. Now, I have kids that are, my oldest ones are 16, 14, and 11. And we were just casually talking around dinner time. And I mentioned to my wife that was also standing there. I go, well, we need to talk to our kids about sex and sexuality a little bit more, and probably, privately talk with them. And they overheard that. And one of them commented, ooh, how awkward. And it made me think that, yeah, that does seem like an awkward thing, but should it be an awkward thing? So I guess I want to throw that back at you from what you've seen in sex and sexuality and pornography. What do you think on how we handle sex and sexuality in our society, and maybe some ideas of how we can do better with it?
Well, I think we handle it absolutely every wrong way possible. And that was one of the big reasons for writing the book. I mean, I wrote the book for two reasons. First was to show people that there is no stereotypical porn addict. I also went to a rehab in 2015, sex addiction rehab in Texas, to focus on my pornography issues. I met doctors and lawyers and nurses and mothers and sons and every type of person you can imagine, from the richest of the rich to the poorest of the poor, white, black, Asian, it doesn't matter. There is no stereotypical porn addict. And I think part of what we've done in society is lead ourselves to believe that, porn addicts are these, grungy, twisted 20-year-old guys living in their mom's basement who have never kissed a girl in real life and have no social skills. Well, that's just not the case. The second reason I wrote the book was for people who perhaps are in the early stages of porn addiction, or perhaps think they may have a problem, to almost be a a cautionary tale or a tale of warning to show that, I never would have thought in my 20 years of porn addiction leading up to the 6, 8 months prior to my arrest that it ever would have led to the criminal and sinister and just heinously twisted places that it did. Never would have predicted that. And I want people who might have a problem with porn to see my story and see this is what can happen to you. I'm hoping, that thankfully this book has given me a platform where people like yourself invite me to talk a little bit, which allows me to reach more people and let them know we have a problem talking about pornography in this culture. And there's a million different theories why, but it doesn't really matter why. We have to start talking about it. The internet arrived 20 years ago, and it delivered any kind of pornography you want with the click of a button. Back when you and I were young, we had to go to a video store, we had to go to an adult theater, we had to go to the corner store and buy a magazine. There was activity that was involved. There was, having to have the nerve to buy something like this. Well, that's gone now, and we're seeing the effects of that on a generation. The scariest statistic that I've seen lately is that 33% of men between 18 and 30 years old believe that they may have a problem with pornography or believe they are completely addicted. That's 1 in 3 men under 30 years old who think they're addicted to pornography. Now, I'm trying to get out there and use my story and share my story, but also just alert people to the fact that right under our noses, we have a massive health crisis forming. And are we going to let this be another opioid crisis or, all of these other social ills that we've had where we're not proactive in taking care of them. We're reactive. And I'm just getting out there trying to share a story that I understand what I did talking about it to you, and I've talked about this hundreds of times. It still is embarrassing. I still feel shame talking about it, but it's important to talk about because, if I can talk about this, anybody can talk about it, and it's important that we do talk about it. We're going to see these men eventually be 40 years old, eventually be 50 years old, eventually be 60 years old. Now, you tell me what happens come year 2040 when, and the statistics suggest that it's going to become even more than 1 in 3. What happens in 20, 30 years when half the men in this country are addicted to pornography? You tell me what kind of world that looks like. And statistics suggest that's exactly what could happen if we don't start doing something soon.
Yeah, I agree. I was listening to some other professionals recently. They were talking about, youth growing up, and they were saying that the main way that youth learn about sex now is through online pornography. And that should startle us, I think. They should be, wait a minute. What is going on? How are they learning about sex? And what do you think about, something like that?
I think that any parent who has a talk about drugs, has a talk about bullying, has a talk about anything that involves health or society's ills in both trying to protect your kid and trying to make sure that they are a decent citizen, they need to start talking about pornography. And I don't think it needs to be a scary discussion. Most of us as parents have been able to keep our kids off drugs just by talking to them about it. There obviously is some education in the schools, and generally in society, we look down on drugs, much like we already do with pornography. It doesn't need to be a graphic talk. It's just that there are pictures out there, there are videos out there of people doing certain things, with their bodies that is not healthy. And, hopefully you won't want to spend too much time looking at it. It's natural to be curious, but this can lead to bad places, just like drugs can lead to bad places, just like smoking can lead to bad places. People get addicted to this stuff, and we need to not be afraid to talk to our kids about this.
Okay, that's very good. So talking, I love it, sharing story about it. What else can we do?
And I think the most important thing, with anything when it comes to communication with your kids is to create a safe space. While I was out gallivanting, running my magazine and trying to become the media baron of Central Maine, my wife did an amazing job with our kids. They can go to her and say anything. They can tell her what's going on with their friends, what's going on with them, personal, embarrassing stuff that I would have never been able to tell my parents. She's been able to foster communication with them because she doesn't judge them and she creates a very safe space for them. And I'm in awe of what she's been able to do with our kids. And I think that if more people can create that safe space, and you have to do it from a young age, but you've got to create that safe space where a child feels like they can tell you anything, and it's not going to be met with, well, you did the wrong thing, or that's not right, or that's bad. If the child didn't do something to your liking, it's worth a discussion about why they did it and what better choices are, and leave it at that. And, hope that you're doing it the right way. But if you can create a safe space with open communication, I've seen it here at my house, and I've read it 4,000 times in all the research I've done. Yeah, it's about a child feeling like they can come to you and say, "Hey, I saw this," or "Hey, I stumbled upon this." Because they want guidance, they want to learn, they want to feel protected, because stumbling upon something incredibly explicit is disconcerting for a kid. If they go to you and suddenly you're saying, "Hey, what are you looking at that kind of stuff for?" Well, that's kind of scary. If I look at this kind of thing, it gets this kind of reaction. If I stumble through no fault of my own onto this kind of thing, it gets this kind of reaction. Well, why is it getting this kind of reaction? Some kids will want to look more into it because it's getting that kind of reaction. You just need to let your child talk to you, and even if you have judgment in your head, there's a way to present it in a way that's healthy and safe for the kid.
That's very good. You remind me when you're sharing that there was a recent study, and another, I should probably know where it came from, but they were talking about, they're studying children, and basically they had a toy there, and they're basically telling the kid they couldn't play with it. And they did 2 different tests with 2 different groups of kids. One they really forbade it really strongly, kind of like you're talking about, the kind of almost that fear level. And the other kids, they just kind of said, "Hey, you're not going to play with this toy." And what they found through the study is the ones that got the strong denial message, they actually were more tempted to play with that toy than the other ones. So there's something about that when we're really forbidden to do something, or really feel that there's that, I don't know if that curiosity within us.
Well,
that we say, "Oh, there's something here I got to check out."
And well, I won't go deep into it, but I can tell you, my parents, I've never seen alcohol touch their lips. They made me believe that if I had ever taken a sip of beer, that I would end up, literally laying in the gutter, holding a big bottle with 2 X's on it, like you see in the Bugs Bunny cartoons. And I would be a hardcore alcoholic for life if I had even a sip of alcohol. And that's what they preached to me from a young age. And I'm the kind of personality type, when you tell me not to do something, or something's bad for me, I want to just try it a little bit and see if you're right. Well, you know what? I had a couple beers and it was great. I felt loose. I felt happy. I felt like a weight was lifted. Well, okay, what else did my parents lie to me about? Okay. And that's the thing, is that I'm not going to necessarily fault them, because they had their own backstories with very alcoholic parents, and had miserable upbringings as the children of alcoholics. But I think they may have overcompensated in trying to explain the ills of it to me. And like you said, with screaming at me, "Don't touch alcohol," it probably had a much stronger influence than just saying, "Hey, this is bad for you. It's not a smart idea."
So it sounds like creating that safe space, talking truthfully, openly, keeping that atmosphere, sounds like that's all helpful. How do you know whether it becomes addiction problem or not? Or is this all of it, you should just get all out of your life? How do you make that line and say, "Well, I can consume a little alcohol, but I'm fine with it," versus it becoming a problem? Same on the porn side. I seen a little porn, it's not a big deal, versus it starting to become an addiction and being a real problem?
Well, I mean, it is one of those things where it's slightly subjective, and there are 101 different definitions of addiction. I think for me, it's first not being honest with people about what your usage is, and whether it's alcohol, drugs, porn, gambling, whatever it is. If you can't be honest with people about what you're doing, because you know it'll be frowned upon, that's a sign that something's wrong if you have to lie about your behavior. Um, Also, if you look at immediately after you engage in the behavior, do you tell yourself that you're not going to do this again, yet you don't have the control to actually keep that promise to yourself? And does that make you feel worse? Do you get stressed out? Do you feel anxiety? Do you feel depression because you're taking part of this behavior that you wish you weren't, but you just find yourself that you can't stop? And that's one of those things that sneaks up on you. Try to for anybody out there who needs that morning coffee. Try not to have your morning coffee. It's not that hard one day. It's not that hard 2 days. Come day 3 or 4, when you're feeling headaches and you know this thing's going to relieve you, you want that coffee. And you'll tell yourself that coffee isn't doing anything bad to you and you're not hurting anybody and it's going to be okay. So you go and you have the coffee. And in the addict's mind, that's the same thing with drugs or porn or alcohol or anything that's an addiction. And then ultimately, I don't think you have to question yourself when you reach a critical phase like I did. You start to have problems at work. You start to get into, extreme type of behaviors. You are experiencing massive depression. There might be financial problems. I mean, it is having a flat out massive effect on your life. And usually you're not questioning yourself if you have it at that point. But if you need to lie about it and you feel very bad afterwards, you may have a bit of an addiction there.
Okay, that's good. That's good for like kind of checking our blind spots, checking ourselves, and that. Because one thing I noticed on your story is that it's very unique. The way you went about it is very unique. And there's a couple parts where you talked about you went on your own. I think one to go gambling, one to go out to New Orleans and be by yourself. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, he's going to fall off the edge doing this, going out by yourself. But for you, it was actually, you stopped the pornography and you stopped the alcohol during that time.
Yeah.
And it was when you got back. So it's very unique for us. We have to be aware of our own things, I think.
Well, the thing was, and I recognized it long after the fact, was that my alcohol use and my porn use was not recreational. It was medicinal. And when I physically removed myself from the problems that I was having here in Maine and took a couple little road trips to clear my mind, well, when I'm away from all the trouble, I don't need the porn. When I'm away from all the trouble, I don't need the alcohol. Those are coping mechanisms for the problems. And when I was able to get away, I was actually able to get away from the vices because I didn't have a need to quell the anxiety and to quell the stress.
So after all this went down and you talked about the arrest day, what was the response to your previous coworkers and the community and your family and stuff through all this?
It was shock. I mean, it was shock. And I've said I wasn't part of discussions around, lunch tables, that day when the news came out. 98% of the people who I communicated with cut everything off with me right then and there. It was clearly, looking at social media at the time, comments on Facebook under the news articles or TV news stories, it was clear that people were more than willing to see me put to death long before any trial was ever going to be held or long before any formal charges or even indictment happened. And even today, 4 years later, the people who are my close friends, they were my close friends long before the magazine ever started. The people who, those in my family who were closest to me, they're still the ones who were closest to me. those people know me at my core. The people who knew me as the obnoxious, celebrity of Central Maine, they, I think they felt very betrayed by me putting on one face and being something else. I think that for a lot of them, it was who didn't like me. It was like, aha, that bastard got what was coming to him. And it still holds true to today. Just a couple weeks ago, I have a friend who is a morning DJ or morning news guy at a radio station locally, and he was thinking about having me on his show to talk about my book. And ultimately, he had to pass on it because he knew that two advertisers would stop advertising if I was put on the show.
Hmm.
I mean, it's one of these things where I can come and talk to you just fine, and I can go on other shows, and people can read my story and articles, and they don't know me from before, so there's no sense of betrayal. I think there's still a big sense of betrayal around here. How could he do this to us? He was lying to us the entire time. He was doing this stuff, and we didn't know anything about it. They also uh, only know what they read in the newspaper or saw on TV. And, Lord can only wonder what gossip was going on at the time. So they got one side of the story. My lawyer specifically told me, if anybody asks you to talk, all you have to say is that you have a position on this, but now is not the time to share it. So that's all I could ever say. I I thought that the reporting was mostly fair, but I also thought that perspective wise, people didn't get the exact snapshot of what was truly happening. Um, at one time, I'm indicted for 12 charges, and ultimately, I pled guilty to three. There was not a whole lot of discussion in the newspaper about why those other charges didn't stick. There was not really a discussion about the amount of pornography I had. There was, I believe that there are people who think that I was probably snatching 5-year-olds from their front yard, which is absolutely ludicrous. But that's the story that they read to themselves or told themselves. That's the story that they've, told each other. And for somebody like me who was always seeking approval and attention of people, one of the big keys to my recovery has just been to let what people think of me go, because I know that there were a lot of people in my immediate vicinity who, I tell you, Jason, I think a bus full of nuns and orphans could careen into the river, and I could go into the freezing water saving them one by one, and there would still be people who would be like, yeah, but he didn't get the bus driver. I think that there is just some people who have decided what they've decided about me, based on what they read, based on the stories they told themselves. They would never think to look at my book. And even if they did read my book, they wouldn't believe a word of it because they've told themselves they're not going to. And that's just something that I have learned to deal with. And I wish I had that as a skill 25 years ago, because I probably would have ended up having a much better life.
That's powerful. I mean, I think you're speaking to the power of story, and that once we have a story in our mind about something, it's pretty hard to change that. And I find that pretty interesting that you were often on the other side of the media telling stories. Now you're flipped over, getting stories told about you. What do you think about that?
That was ironic. I had, I've been on the front page of the newspaper hundreds of times with bylines, and I'd been on the front page of the newspaper with the city council being part of stories for good things. And then all of a sudden I did this terrible, terrible thing. And there I am, 6 columns across the top of the page. And reading the story, it made me look at the way that I did reporting through the years. And here's a really good example. Right as this happened, in Maine, I don't know how it works everywhere, but the police bring you to jail, they book you, and then a bail commissioner shows up and decides what your bail is going to be set at. and that's done right in the lobby of the county sheriff's office. You don't go in front of a judge or anything for that. Um, and there are mostly templates that they follow. If somebody does X, this is what their bail will be. If somebody does Y, this is what their bail will be. There's not a lot of deviation. And when I met the bail commissioner, he showed me what my conditions were, and one of them was that I couldn't be around anybody under 18 years old, including my kids. And I said to him, I've got no record. I can't be around my kids at all. What if, that seems extreme, since this is just an accusation, and it's not an accusation that even has to do with anything involving hands-on stuff. And he said, you're right, this is a non-contact offense. You have no record. Okay. And he took a pen and amended it to say that I could be around my children as long as an adult over 18 years old was with us. And while that was a real pain in the ass for the next 2 years while the legal system worked its way out, that's the way that it was from day one, was that I could be around my kids as long as an adult was there. Um, Unfortunately, I think that the moment I was arrested, based on going into my office and being told that it was already on one newspaper and other newspapers showed up, I have a feeling that the Maine State Police had a press release ready about my arrest, and that the moment that it was radioed in that I was officially arrested, they sent it out to the media, because it got out so fast. It had to be pre-written. And I know of organizations that do pre-write press releases. I know of newspapers and magazines who pre-write obituaries. You have to be prepared. And in their press release, they included that I couldn't be around anybody who was under 18, because that was the template that they generally used. Well, it was incorrect, yet it went out to the media. Now, I don't fault the media for reporting that I couldn't be around anybody under 18, because that's the information that they got. They got wrong information, and they reported wrong information. Uh, there's not necessarily anybody at fault. Maybe you could point that the state police could wait an hour or two and find out what the bail conditions actually are, and it's not going to hurt anybody's deadline. But for the next 3-4 months, anytime there was a story about me in the newspaper, it specifically said I couldn't be around anybody under 18, yet there I was, living at home with my kids and my wife. They were just reporting information wrong, and that made me look back over the years of all the reporting I did, wondering, how many times did I get information incorrect? How many times was I given? And this is not just a poor reporting, but how many times was I given factually incorrect information that I ran in the newspaper? And I was not just a fluff features writer. I was an investigative reporter. I did city government. I did police. I did important stuff. Were there times that I reported things incorrectly and created a reality for the readers that was not the reality, in real life? This actually reminded me, and just to get off track here for a sec, when I was finally allowed to be a real reporter in the sports department, I was sent out to a softball game. I think I was 18 years old, covering as the opening round of the high school playoffs. And there was a girl who hit a triple to lead off the game. She was stranded on third base. And what occurred to me when I went back to the office was this important enough to write about? Because nothing happened. A triple is pretty impressive, but nothing had happened. She wasn't driven in. It didn't count as a run. You could go look at the box score, which was buried 4 pages later, and see that she got a triple. But if I didn't include the fact she got a triple in that story, well, then for tens of thousands of people reading that story, the triple never existed. It only existed for the people who were there to witness it. And that was something that played on me, and I tried to keep in mind as I was a journalist. But going through it and being on the subject side in a very negative way with my arrest and the entire legal process, it really made me wonder how often I had unintentionally painted a picture with wrong facts.
Yeah. and the power of those stories that may have carried for someone.
And it's one of those things with time, people just, they believe stories, and stories slightly twist over time. And like I said, I wanted to get this book out, hopefully so a few people could at least, I don't want to say see my side of it, because I don't think there's necessarily a side of it, but just clear up what I thought was factually incorrect material. And you read the book. I don't really take anybody to task.
No.
I just wanted to say and drive home the point that everything you're reading here may not be correct all the time. But it's one of those things where you have to learn to let that go too.
Yeah. One thing as I've done this podcast and talked to people and heard their stories, it's the importance of our personal story has elevated my mind, and my own personal stories become more important to me. And one of the questions I've played with and tried to investigate is, what do you do with these harder parts of your story? Sometimes we pass through some trials. Maybe we have some abuse in our youth, or some bad decisions happened. And what do we do with that? But then I think on yours, it even goes to another level of difficulty, is that when you were the one that did the bad thing, or you're the one that made the bad choice, what do you do with those stories in your past? Any insights on that?
Well, I know I hate the words child pornography, but that's what I did. And, I prefer saying underage pornography. I prefer saying illegal pornography. It just sounds better to me. And I think it's a little bit softer for other people. But the fact was, I took screen captures of a 14-year-old girl. I created child pornography. I exploited that girl. And for most people who did what I did, who don't have the public recognition that I did, they really, slip under the radar. And I, still attend a group therapy with several men who weren't all over the newspaper for what they did. And some of them had actual hands-on, physical abuse. And they live with so much shame, and they live with so much embarrassment. And as I mentioned, I still do have it, and I don't think it's ever going to go away. But I have found telling my story has helped me make sense of it. The first version of my book, and my book ended up about 90,000 words. The first version that I actually wrote in jail with pencil into composition books was over 200,000 words. And most of it was just cathartic to get it out of my head. To tell my story to myself. And I've got these notebooks, and I don't know that I'll ever read them. I probably won't. But that was something I needed to do. I needed to tell myself my story. And then I recognized that because I had this very public outing, my skeletons are out there. You can go on Google and search my name, and you can go through records and learn all kinds of details about what I was accused of and what I actually did. And none of it's very fun or makes me feel good, but the fact is it's out there. With a lot of people, it's not out there. Since it's out there with me, is there something that I can do to move forward? Something in me tells me, moving forward, I need to tell this story. And I thought it was just going to be through this book, to be perfectly honest with you, for the last year and a half as I was working on it. But for the last couple months, I've been coming on shows like yours and telling my story again and again. And there's a lot of things I said tonight that I've said a couple dozen times already. And there are some new things I've said. But I keep coming on these shows, and I know I don't have a bestseller on my hands. This is too taboo a topic. It's too much of a niche. I'm lucky if I sell 1 or 2 copies a day. I get that. But I have this pull and I have this tug to keep telling my story and keep talking about this, because I think I can do some good in the world. And I think other people's stories, especially the bad parts, can help people in this world. And yes, there are a lot of people who were just like me, who learn things the hard way, who you say one thing to and they go do another. But there are a whole lot of people who do take advice, who do hear people's stories and understand them as the cautionary tales they are. I think we would be better off as a society if those things that we feel worst about, those bad decisions, those poor results, if we talked more about them openly, we might not have a society that makes so many bad choices. We might not have such a reactive society. We may have a proactive society. I realize now that I wrote this book. It's just one step in my recovery. Another step is continuing to share my story. Thank you. You and I probably wouldn't be talking if I hadn't written this book. So this book allowed me to get onto your show to tell my story. Maybe somebody's listening to your show right now who will share my story with a friend of theirs who maybe has a problem. Um, that's where I feel, and I don't know if it's from God. I don't know if I'm telling myself stories. I don't know what it is exactly, but I feel this need to tell this story because I know there are so many people who don't have the constitution and the ability to share their story the way that I can. So I almost feel like it's a duty at this point, and I know it's helping with my recovery. Sharing this story so many times reminds me of where I was, what I did, and what my goals are moving forward.
No, that's good. I do appreciate that. Do you ever get, or do you still do, where you look back and say, "What if only if," and if so, how do you get through that?
I did that for a long time. I think I stopped doing it actually around the time I was writing the book. Because I can't change what happened. I wish I could. If I could, I'd go back and change it 100 times over. I would go back, and when my cousin called me upstairs to look at Penthouse for the first time, I wouldn't go. When I was at that wedding and nobody was paying attention and I was taking champagne off the abandoned tables, I wouldn't do that. And I can then go month by month through my life and tell you the things that I wouldn't do. But I can't change any of that. I'm here today. And again, this is perhaps the story I tell myself and how I make sense of things, but maybe I wasn't put on this earth to be a hotshot magazine producer. Maybe I wasn't put on this earth to, present film festivals and serve as a politician. Maybe the reason I was put on this earth was to help people with this problem. Maybe I had to go through all this. Maybe and I consider every woman, whether they were 14 or 17 or 23 or 38, who I manipulated online to be a victim. They all were. It doesn't matter if they were 18 or not. They were all victims of mine. If I can somehow share a narrative that creates less victims, and there's no way to measure, but if somehow sharing my story again and again causes less overall victims in the world. If there's one person who isn't a victim, or one more person who isn't a victim than the number of victims that I had, maybe it's a net good. And maybe this is all rationalizing about what I'm doing now. But I just feel like the power of my story, it's one that isn't being told, and it's one that science and statistics suggest really should be told right now. I go back to the opioid crisis again and again. You can go back and look at old episodes of cop shows from the 60s. I mean, I remember watching Dragnet on Nick at Night, and they're talking about the problems of heroin. And, I grew up in my late teens, early 20s listening to rappers talk about abusing Vicodin. Anybody who thinks that the opioid crisis is something that we didn't see coming is not paying attention. We should have seen this coming from a mile away. There were all the markers there, and we weren't proactive. We're reactive. I don't want this to be the same thing with porn in 20, 30 years. People going, oh my gosh, I can't believe this was happening. It's happening, and I can tell my story. I can share the statistics. Thankfully, I have a little bit of a platform now, and to waste that would be unconscionable.
That's a good point. And I'm glad you are talking about it, because I think it is, like I said earlier, it's something we need to talk about more. And even if it's, even my first impression, I'm looking at your book and think, wow, do I want to talk to this guy? Because it's kind of a tough topic, right? It's like, well, I go, no, I need to talk to him.
Well, and I have people who book me for shows and then think better of it or worse of it. I have people who I've approached and said, would you be interested in having me as a guest? And they're, oh, absolutely not. And it's like, well, you understand this is a massive problem, and yeah, but look what you did. I don't want people to think I'm supporting this. And it's like, you're not providing information is not supporting. And I understand as far as my story goes, I am a very, very imperfect messenger. But until there's a Boy Scout who comes along and wants to share these stories, I'll be the messenger, and I just hope that there are people who listen. And I really have to, thank you as well for giving somebody like me, like you said, there's trepidation there, but you gave me a platform to tell my story. It's reaching people. Hopefully, some of them will share my story. Some of them will, look inwardly on their own lives or the lives of the ones close to them. Hopefully the story does some good, and you deserve some credit for, having the bravery and the ability to give somebody who's in my position this platform. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, appreciate it too, Joshua, for coming on and being open about it, because it's not, like I said, it's not easy to be on that side and to, like you said, you still feel some shame about it, but appreciate you putting it out there to hopefully that we start talking about this, we start doing better work, society at large, that we start doing better at this, because like you mentioned, I don't want to see 30 or 40 years down the road and what it could be if we don't start addressing this now.
Absolutely. And, there are plenty of resources out there. Like I said, my book is a memoir. My book is not facts and figures. It's not how to or self-help. It's the story of me just going downhill. I think it's an easy entry for a lot of people who might be curious what porn addiction really looks like. I think you can attest it's not a dry, boring read.
No, it's not.
And anybody who is interested in it or wants resources, because like I said, there's not a lot of resources in this book. If you want resources, go to my website. That's recoveringpornaddict.com. You'll get resources there. You'll get facts and figures there. And you'll also be able to get a picture of what my recovery has looked like. And I talk to a lot of wives and girlfriends wondering if their boyfriend or husband is addicted. Just the other day, I had a man from the UK, very similar situation as mine. He's just entered the legal process. And, we exchanged emails for a day or two. And I think that while he has a rough road ahead of him, I think knowing he's not completely alone makes him feel better. And I think that's part of what stories do. And that's why I've continued to tell my story through my website. All
right. Well, Josh, this has been very enlightening, very, very needed conversation, I think, to go out there. So I want to thank you for coming on StoryHinge, and we'll keep supporting this and helping us to have better conversations around this, better stories around sex, sexuality, pornography, alcoholism, and all that, so that we can make improvements.
Thank you.
All right. I want to thank Josh for coming on to StoryHinge. I want to thank you all for being here, even after an hour and about 20 minutes at this point. I hope this is helpful for you out there. Hope some of you cause you to think. And if there's I guess my invitation is just that if you are struggling with some of this, with some form of addiction, that you go get help. I'm not no professional in that area. I'm just a guy who talking to other people and hearing story. And my hope is that life gets better for all of us, that our own personal stories improve. And so I thought this was a pretty instrumental discussion, and talking about, what if we did something really bad in our lives? What do we do with that story? And I appreciate Josh and his example of, trying to turn that into something good. If nothing else, let it be a warning voice for others. And I know that's not easy. And, a couple parts of his story and his, some of his ideas about, the harder parts of our own story are things that we should be talking about. A couple of ideas come to mind when I think about that concept. And one is that maybe the first step is just being honest with ourselves. To be really open and honest with ourselves, and to say, here's my full self, really. Here's some of the challenges I have. And not to beat ourselves up about it, not to, beat ourselves with shame about it, but that to realize that we're having a human experience here. And there are light and dark sides in all of us. And, sometimes we have to go through some of those challenging things. The other part, I guess, on that is that, I don't know of anything really that where we try to hide from it, or we try to keep something in the dark. something festering in the dark. I don't know how that ever turns out healthy. It just seems like we have to bring those things out into the light. And like I said, maybe not only to ourselves, but let that be the first step. And again, we hear the emphasis on writing our story again. And I think this has been pert near 100% of the guests who have talked about what do you do with your own story. They said to write it in some form or fashion. And again, we heard that from Josh. And so, I invite you out there who are, looking on how to improve your own story, may have challenging things in your own history and your own past, to write some of that out. And, I've been doing that myself and through various forms of, I've had a journal since high school. And so there's some of that in there. I've also been taking pieces of my story this past couple of years and just writing different pieces of that story out and examining that, looking at, see what it means. And, some of it I'm actually having fun with and creating actual stories for storytelling. So that's another fun aspect of it. But you guys, I hope this is helpful for you out there, for someone. And, I thank you again for being here on StoryHinge, for spending time. And we're going to keep bringing you more valuable content, more ways to improve your own story, more understanding of story itself, and how for any of you out there who are creatives of story, whether writing or speaking or, film or what have you, that we're going to try to add value into your story creation. So thank you. I invite you to subscribe to the podcast, share it with others. There's been some updates on the website, so I invite you to go there, storyhinge.com. And, I wanted to invite you to subscribe to the newsletter. There's a contact page there and a newsletter to subscribe to. And here in April, I'm going to start releasing the plan is a monthly newsletter to give you a little bit more in-depth dive about story. And this first month, we'll have some of Aristotle's thoughts on what is story, what makes a good story. So enough there. We've had a long one this week, you guys. Looking forward to next week. You guys have a great one.
Thank you for sharing with us at StoryHinge. We hope this time together has added more goodness to your journey. Until next time, onward and upward, and may your own story continue to grow more beautiful.